Fake news is not a new phenomenon in Southeast Asia. It has been around for quite some time. But the awareness among the general public has only been in the last few years. It is a worrying trend when it generates hate against members of a community. Experts believe that most of the time, fake news come from ruling politicians. They've been using it to discredit their opponents and critics. Southeast Asia expert Dr. James Gomez of the Asia Center sat down with me to share his concerns and how to fight fake news. Good morning, James.
Good morning.
Good to see you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
Yeah, after a while, it's been a long time.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so you are here on a tour talking about fake news. So the concept of fake news has been on for a while, but it kind of very much used recently, especially in the U.S. after the presidential election in 2016, talking about the intervention, and President Trump has been using this a lot. But what about in Southeast Asia? What is the trend in Southeast Asia? What the source and how to fight that?
Right. Okay. So you're absolutely right. The awareness of fake news in Southeast Asia really came in 2016 elections here in the U.S. and also with Brexit. The vote for the Brexit in the UK. So that was also another incident where the notion of fake news was quite high up in the agenda and created a lot of awareness in Southeast Asia. But I think the fundamental difference between what's happening in the US and Southeast Asia is Donald Trump used the term fake news to do reputation harm to the traditional media that is based on fact-checking. Right, fact-based media. However, in Southeast Asia, generally most governments, authoritarian regimes, one-party states, military regimes, sultanates, what they do is they use fake news to do reputation harm to their critiques. So that's very different here because in Southeast Asia, most of the traditional media is owned by the governments and is quite aligned to government political viewpoints. So the opposite view really comes from alternative media and the critiques, civil society critics, opposition politicians. So you find sitting regimes and sitting politicians from ruling parties and other institutions using fake news to do damage to their opponent. And that's the fundamental situation. Now, in terms of definitions, I think broadly we can make two types of definitions of fake news in Southeast Asia. I think one is what we call everyday fake news. Yes. For example, in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, there's always fake news about traffic jam. Everybody's annoyed because sometimes you don't know where to go, whether the traffic jam is real or not, and you get caught up and people are absolutely annoyed. But back to what really is the highlight is fake news about politics. Now, whether you talk about Malaysia or in Thailand or Indonesia and certainly in Cambodia, the volume of fake news is always about politics. Now, governments in Southeast Asia and Cambodia included always talk about fake news and they want to control the fake news of others. But the problem is, it is the government and the ruling politicians who are the creators and dissemination of fake news. And therein lies the problem. Because in Southeast Asia, many governments are introducing laws. Malaysia has introduced a fake news legislation, and this has been kind of on the books to be repealed. Singapore used the term online deliberate falsehood, and it has passed legislation to that effect. Cambodia, in its run-up to the last elections, also threatened to introduce measures against fake news. But then at the end of the day, we find out it's the ruling party politician, including Hun Sen, are the ones actually, generating fake news. And then when you look at the law where it has been passed in countries in Southeast Asia, they talk about fake news of others, especially of their critiques, but the legislation doesn't cover fake news by the state or the sitting politician. So there is a fundamental disconnect in Southeast Asia, first in terms of how fake news is defined, and it's often defined by government officials, always in challenge to their critiques. And then what we see in reality is these governments, authoritarian regimes, and their representatives like prime ministers and presidents who are guilty of generating the most vicious fake news, and often about their politicians and opponents.
Absolutely, and this makes the job for a journalist much harder, and also at the same time more valuable than before. Yes, so what should the general public do or be aware of, how can they check if the news that they are consuming is actually fake? Because you are in the region in Southeast Asia, you know how politics is being played and how party loyalists operate, and some people would, even the consumer themselves are biased. If they support the ruling party, anything come from the ruling party, would be 100% true, and another side would be fake news. It's not just the state that spread this. So how, with this environment, how can we verify and how can we fight this so that the real news is out in the public?
Okay. There are generally 4 types of efforts being undertaken by everyone concerned. I mean, fake news is a general concern. I mean, it's a real problem, and governments, people, society, politicians, educators, all try to find a reasonable solution to it. And there are 4 methods that are being used in the region and around the world. First is fact-checking, to ensure that whatever information that's put out is fact-checked. And second is the promotion of media literacy, usually through schools, through university. It can also be done for adults in the public domain as well. Thirdly, it's improving the skill of journalists so that we can ensure there is quality journalism, and also to ensure that quality journalism is more well-read than, let's say, fake news. And then the fourth really is trying to get the technology companies also involved to do their part to manage the algorithms, or to ensure that fake news doesn't come up in the feed so much, and putting up more sort of quality journalism and good information up there for the viewers. Having said that, we also need to be critical about all these 4 measures, because when we say fact-checking, we have to determine who is doing the fact-checking and who's paying money for fact-checking. You will find many governments themselves set up fact-checking websites and units, and they fund it, and they are giving the government version of the truth, which itself is fake news. That's one. For those who are a little bit more genuine and really are independent and want to do fact checks, they are often impacted by the lack of resources, because fact checking is not easy. It takes some time, and most of them is staffed by very little people, and sometimes there's also skill issues involved, because sometimes they don't check fact, they check opinion, so and the other challenge is speed. Right, because one of the difficulties with fact-checking is you can't meet the viralization speed of fake news. So the fake news is already out and making the impact by the time you do the check and put the real information. Yes, you can call it out, and yes, you can say after the fact, yes, that was fake news, and it may have some impact and embarrass the people who put out those information in the first place, but the information is already out. Media literacy. I think for me, given that a lot of the fake news is around politics, I think an important part of media literacy should be political literacy. Political literacy about democracy, human rights, and the real intentions of the politicians or the regime on all sides to determine what is really effective and truthful out there. But again, with media literacy program, it requires resources, and we also need to know who is running the media literacy program, because if governments are spending the money and promoting literacy. They may be promoting literacy on their version of the truth. And one has to be mindful of that. And the third item is quality journalism and the truth. And this is a bit of a challenge because unlike in the past where good journalism was read by more people, it had a good impact and influence. However, I find that quality journalism and good journalism is only part of the many types of journalism that the consumer has to navigate. So now in our media ecosystem, quality journalism, fact-based, verified information is actually only becoming a small component of the many components of which many of it are fake, that is affecting our media landscape and media ecosystem. Last but not least, the technology companies, yes, they are interested in business. They may not share the same values such as democracy, human rights, and political pluralism. They are interested in the bottom line. Yes, they are, sending their people to attend meetings and discussions, and they want to engage with governments and civil society, and they do that. But they have their company policy, and they will send their representative who will repeat the company policy. I think across the board, from all stakeholders, they are still not convinced about the genuine contribution of the technology companies to resolve this problem, because the fake news problem is real, and it becomes problematic when fake news generates hate against others, and that's something that we need to think about.
Yeah. So on the first part about technology company, because for example, like in Cambodia, not only in Cambodia but in other part of the world as well, people, the habit of news consumption is now through social media. For example, like the case of Cambodia, just a few days ago, there were news about an opposition activist was murdered by police and disappeared and murdered, but it turned out to be fake news. So do you think the technology company should be more responsible than any other three of the actors that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah. So I think also, to be fair to the technology company, I think first of all, one needs to know how fast we inform the technology company that such an information is indeed fake. So who does the verification? So we need to be clear. Is it an independent source that's constantly monitoring what's out in the social media and verifying whether some content is true or not? So that's one question. And the second question, should the technology company itself internally be verifying this information so that it doesn't have to rely on a third party to alert it? The second step of the process is, once it's being alerted that this is indeed false information, how fast is the takedown now? That's the problem with the technology companies, because they, for situations like Facebook, they will say, look, we have community standards. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 criteria, and if we find that it is within our community standards, we will allow this, because part of their community standards is to evaluate the context of the information that's being shared. But they find in many cases when there's fake news as being identified, especially of some very significant concern that may affect harmony in communities, you find that most people are quite unhappy with the speed in which the technology companies remove harmful content that can affect the harmony in societies.
Thank you so much, Jem, for coming to VOA and talk, discuss about Cambodian politics and also fake news here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to be here.